Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Medicine 3.0, your place for AI in medicine, precision medicine, and the best information for healthcare. I am so excited about this week. This week is Josh Turknett. He is an MD neurologist from Georgia who, in his own health journey and his own music learning, came up with an amazing platform for teaching people complex tasks, which is so important for your brain health. And we had such a wide-ranging conversation on what are the practical things people can do to avoid cognitive decline and dementia. I think you're going to love it. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. All right, Josh, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, excited to dig in on this. I'm going to start with the question I always start with. How did you get where you're at knowing what you know?
All right. I'll try not to take up the next 5 hours. So I am a neurologist by training, and so I have a long-standing interest in the brain. A lot of that came through an interest in both the sort of cognition and particularly in learning. So I've kind of always been addicted to the learning process. That first came through sports, then through music. Directed that interest in the brain ultimately towards going to medical school and wanting to become a neurologist. So did that, graduated from Emory, and then went to the University of Florida, trained there in neurology, and then went out into private practice 4 years here in the Atlanta area. And, first few years were pretty good, but kind of over time, for a variety of reasons, came to realize that a lot of the issues that I was seeing as a neurologist were related to lifestyle and preventable types of things, weren't amenable to the treatments that I had available as a neurologist, pharmaceuticals and surgeries. At the same time, began developing an interest in, what are the root causes of the conditions that we're seeing, both personally and professionally. That led me to an interest in ancestral health, which was initially kind of the paleo diet, years ago. And through my own sort of personal experimentations with changing how I ate, changing how I lived, and the remarkable results that had for me personally, individually, I then realized how much more we could already be doing for our patients. So, and then feeling, and one of the conditions that I suffer from is migraines. And one of the things that happened was from that was that it had a dramatic effect on my own migraine. So here I was, a neurologist and an expert in this condition, and I had inadvertently stumbled upon something that was better than anything else that I'd tried before. So, there's a pretty big aha moment for me. So those were kind of all the various factors that over time made me increasingly unsettled with being in the place that I was in, where I felt like there was so much more that I could be doing, but I couldn't deliver it. Right. That kind of created a motivation for what I could do about it. Along the same time, I have a long-standing interest in music, and I started really getting into it actually during residency. And it was then that I also, having this interest in cognition, in learning, I had my undergraduate degree was in cognitive neuroscience. And this was around the time when we were, when the sort of paradigm that the adult brain was fixed, right? Mm-hmm. That we couldn't, childhood was the time you could learn complex things. And then as an adult, things were pretty fixed. And that was being overturned entirely in the late 20th century. And so all that was kind of happening or had just happened. And to me, that meant, a lot of what we believed was wrong. So we had this emerging science that told us our brain was much more capable than we thought throughout our lives. And yet our understanding of that had not informed, how we were learning things, how we were going about things, including music. So at the time that I'm learning music, I thought, how can these principles need to be incorporated in some way. That is ultimately what turned into BrainJo, which is the company that I ultimately ended up creating, based on those ideas, which was the premise of integrating the science of learning and neuroplasticity into, how we learn music. And that came from initially my personal experience learning to play the banjo initially in residency. So that's where the name came from. BrainJo is a combination of brain and banjo. And using those principles and, learning and being more successful than the conventional wisdom would have said I should be, right? Not based on anything unique or special about me, just about how I was trying to incorporate these, best practices and what we were learning about how the brain changes, because learning anything is ultimately about brain change.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyways, I turned that concept eventually into an online platform for learning, integrating these principles of how to learn best, how to leverage the mechanisms of neuroplasticity to learn music, and initially with a course of instruction around banjo, and then adding other instruments over time. That business grew to the point where I exited my full-time neurology practice and then devoted more and more time to developing BrainJo. And so now I'm at the point where I have this BrainJo, which is about neuroscience-based musical instruction, but also is about promoting the critical importance of lifelong learning and cognitive stimulation in maintaining cognitive health and preventing cognitive decline, and the role that learning, in particular complex skills like music, can play in that. So I'll stop there. That was a long-winded roundabout way of getting to where I am, but that's kind of, but it was roundabout. So I guess that's appropriate.
Well, it's so interesting to me, physicians who spend years and years, and what a neurology fellowship was it, or residency, was it 4 years?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So 4 years of med school, 4 years of neurology training. And many people might look at you now and say, well, he's not practicing neurology. And I'm curious, like, what was that like to make the decision to leave the clinical practice of neurology? And then how do you see the impact of what you're doing today versus kind of the impact of clinical practice? Like, how do you think about that differently?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. Like I said, one of the reasons for the desire to move out of clinical practice was I didn't feel like I could make the impact that I could make using the knowledge and expertise that I had, right? And that was ultimately that's why we got into it to begin with, right? That's why we go through our training. We're trying to help people in the best way we can. And for a number of reasons, I didn't feel like I had the ability to do that in the way that I could do that inside of the clinic. And of course, it's like that's not a decision you make overnight. And I also had the experience of, while I was practicing, I mentioned the effect that it had on my migraines. And one of the things that from that was I couldn't even really deliver that to the patients that I had, right? So I wrote a book about it. I created an online community for people. And through that, just through those actions, was able to make far greater impact on people's lives than I ever could in the clinic, right? Mm-hmm. Just from putting information out there and in a way that people could actually implement, versus there was, I can't sit with someone for an 8-hour visit, and give them all the things that I need. There was just not. So the only thing that you can do in that situation is just write a script or whatever. And so that, was clear evidence that my impact would be greater outside of the clinic than inside of it, especially given the nature of the kind of conditions that I was treating. The same, I think, is true now of cognitive decline and dementia. We have so much that we can do that can help, right? That we already know, and it's just a matter of getting the ideas out there and getting it and having people implement them. Um, and I can't do that. I can't help that project, right, inside of the clinic. So to actually fulfill, what I feel like is to fulfill the role that I initially signed up for, right? If I'm thinking in that big picture terms, I could do a much better job doing what I'm doing now of actually fulfilling that promise than I could in the clinic.
Yeah, I love that. I feel very similar. And when I left clinical practice, I had a good friend who he was actually a scribe with me in the ER. And he said, Jared, don't leave. Like, you're a great ER doc, and there aren't a ton of great ER docs. And there's this pressure when you train in a specialty, when you're great at a specialty, to be the one there taking care of the sick patients. And we need those people. Absolutely. We need
Right.
great neurologists. We need great ER docs delivering care to those who are ill. At the same time, like yourself, I feel like there's an opportunity for such a bigger impact on a broader scale, and likely saving many more lives than we would be doing otherwise if we were in the clinic. So thanks
Yeah.
for sharing your story and being willing to
Yeah.
take that risk.
And I think it's important to point out too, I needed that experience to get to where I am. Right.
That's right.
So, and I think one of it's just from personal level, I don't think I was cut out to do the same thing day in and day out for 40 years, and
Right.
I think that's okay. Right. Like,
Yeah.
I think so many physicians think once you're locked in, and that can't be, but it doesn't have to be that way. Right.
Right.
You can do it for 15, 20 years and move on. And that's okay. Like, we're wired to kind of want new experiences, and maybe that's that's the more natural way to go about it. So.
Right. Now, when you started BrainJo and you're kind of learning the best science to teach music, at what point do you start realizing or thinking, well, this could be really helpful for those with mild cognitive decline or those who are on a path towards poor brain health as they age? Was that always built in, or is this kind of like a byproduct of as you went down this path?
Yeah. So I think there was some element of that, from the beginning, but the research on and the evidence that for the benefits of cognitive stimulation throughout the lifespan and how significant of a role that plays, that has continued to grow since I started doing this. So I realized as this platform was growing, like, this was a wonderful opportunity for me to be sharing that message, right? That learning complex skills, continuing to stimulate the brain, is, in my opinion, the most significant factor in any sort of comprehensive plan for brain health and brain fitness. And to the pieces for all that didn't kind of fully fall into place, I think, until recent years. So it was fortunate that I was already in a position where I had something that could help to deliver that particular message. And I think too that having that framing around something like music changes people's relationship to it. So, and if they're going just from the standpoint of, I want to really get good at music, that brings about a whole certain set of psychological, factors, versus I'm doing this to help my brain, right? A lot of the things that might limit us if we're just framing it from the other perspective, kind of melt away when you're just thinking of it as you might think of a trip to the gym. So it's also, a way to get more people into music and into all the rewarding things, and to sort of, so much of the work that I do is about dealing with mindsets and beliefs that limit people in taking on challenges like music. And so that they can experience all the many psychological and health benefits from it.
Yeah. Just real quick before I forget, you mentioned that it's not just banjo anymore. What are the different instruments people can learn with you?
So there's banjo, or two different styles, what's called clawhammer banjo and fingerstyle banjo, or up-picking banjo. And then there's a course for piano, ukulele, and fiddle. And
Awesome.
yeah, and hopefully in the not too distant future there'll be guitar. So.
Awesome. That's so cool. All right. So I take care of a lot of people who their number one fear is cognitive decline, Alzheimer's. Maybe they've had genetic testing done and they have ApoE44 and they're scared. Or maybe even just 3-4, and they're scared because they have an increased risk for some cognitive decline as they age. And so I'm curious, I'd love to hear your take on a couple things. First, do you know of any way, and I've researched this bit and I can't say there are some things that I know, but there's many that I don't. Do you know of any way to really understand somebody's risk for cognitive decline, screening, whether that's, cognitive testing, blood test, PET scan, like all these different things that people can spend money on?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing that I'd want to talk about is, okay, what are the things they can do to maybe offset or try to prevent those things as much as possible?
So I think the challenge of the risk is there's obviously outside of familial autosomal dominant patterns of inheritance for Alzheimer's, which is not the norm, right?
Yep.
There are so many factors. So everybody's path to dementia is unique,
Mm-hmm.
like literally. So there's they might converge in a common set of clinical characteristics, but everybody gets there kind of a different way. So that makes like any one. So everybody's set of factors that took them there is going to be different than others. So that makes it really hard to say what single thing or what you could do to actually predict someone's risk. But from a practical perspective, I mean, we do know what lifestyle factors are associated with a heightened risk.
Mm-hmm.
We also know what factors are necessary for maintaining synaptic health, and what are the constituents of a neuron, like the things that you need from your diet, right, to keep a healthy brain. So you can kind of use those that theoretical and empirical information to construct a pretty reasonable approach to not just assessing risk, but optimizing your protection. So that's really what we're trying to do. And for that, I think number one, just monitoring cognitive function, right? That's ultimately how all of this is manifesting, right? So having a way of monitoring it, and that can be both sort of real world, how are you doing in the things that you care about doing that involve your brain, right? And then that can also be formal, cognitive screening, and so obviously that is, having some way of gauging how you're actually doing is going to matter. And then the other piece, I think, monitoring sort of basic blood work, right? You want to, you want to make sure that conditions that we know of that are, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, things that we know dramatically increase risk, that we're dealing with those. And then also we want to make sure that nutritional factors that we know are related are adequately addressed. B12 status being, a big one. We know that plays a major role. Things like vitamin D, magnesium, certain nutrients like zinc, copper, making sure that nutritional status is met. So there are kind of two things to think about in terms of keeping a healthy brain throughout our life. We have stimulation on one side, and we have support on the other side, right? You want to be stimulating the brain. You want to make sure it has what it needs to respond to that, right? And that's, so having what it needs primarily is about leading a lifestyle that we know will provide those factors, and then doing testing to look for any potential deficiencies or that would suggest that the brain isn't getting enough of what it needs in a particular in a particular area. Um, so I think in that way, that's kind of a way of customizing it to an individual and having it, adapt rather than a single snapshot. Say we're going to get a genetic profile and see what your risk is, right? Well, your risk
Hmm.
is always changing based on every single factor that matters, right? So it really
Yeah.
has to be adaptive and dynamic in order to make the most of it. And it has to be individualized because we know that the route is always going to be individual. So it's complex, but we do have the tools to do a lot of it, already.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that, the genetics is so interesting because people want to think of it as deterministic,
Right.
and for the most part it's not.
Right.
There are a few things that
Exactly.
here and there, but usually you know that early on in your life.
Right.
Some of them, like Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's, and things like that, you might discover later in life. Um, and so if you take genetics and then, like you said, you look at lifestyle factors, you can definitely suss out some things there. You mentioned cognitive testing, and you mentioned formal cognitive testing. Do you think there's any use or utility in any of like the direct to consumer, like come do your cognitive testing here or brain games kind of thing, as far as understanding what your risk is for dementia as you age?
I think that I do think there is value in it, and I hope that there's still room for improvement
Hmm.
in those in that testing. But we have the technology to do that, to really get a lot better with those. There is one. There's a really good test at foodforthebrain.org,
Hmm.
which also has a very nutritional focus. So that's a good place if you want to get a kind of a comprehensive evaluation, and you could do something like once a year or whatever. I think of it more as less about trying to understand risk, but and more about just as a metric of how am I doing,
Yep.
and is there any particular area that where I would need to improve, including is there an area of cognition that's underperforming relative to my other areas, and what could I be doing to enhance that? I think that's one of the most important messages that I'm trying to get across, is that this is not a passive process, right?
Mm.
We are actively influencing our risk all the time. So it's more of having understand what we can do to be optimizing, our own function and cognitive health over time, rather than just this is my chance, these are my odds, and there's not much I can do about it.
Right. Well, and I think, as an ER doc, I'm always like trained to think like, what's the worst thing that could be happening? And
Mm-hmm.
like, let's prevent that thing
Right,
or
right, right.
rule
Yes,
out that thing.
yes,
And I think if we all just take the mindset of the worst thing that's happening is my brain is aging and I've got a risk of mild, or I have a risk of cognitive decline.
right,
And so I should do everything I need to optimize that right now. Um, and I think different people might take it to different extremes.
mm-hmm.
But if you take that mindset of I have risk for cognitive decline and I don't want it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And let's take like somebody that's a little bit older, just because I don't know that 20-year-olds are thinking about
Right,
cognitive decline as much as some of us as we age. So let's take like a 45-year-old.
mm-hmm.
If you were talking with a 45-year-old and they said, "Hey, I really want to not ever have cognitive decline, or at least want to stack the deck in my favor.
Mm-hmm.
What are the things I should be doing right now and over the next few decades? And do those things change over the decades, or do those things stay the same?" I'd
Right,
love to hear your thoughts.
right. Um, So I think going back to that, the big picture model is stimulate and support. So you think, what am I? So someone who's 45 probably is still in the midst of their working career, right? Which for most people that is their primary cognitive stimulus, and that obviously varies according to what type of job it is, right? So how cognitively demanding it is going to depend on the nature of it. So one is just kind of, is the job that I'm doing, sort of providing a robust cognitive stimulus, or would there be room for, other to sort of shore that up in other parts of my life? And for that, the thing that I recommend is real world complex skills, whether it's music, whether it's dance, whether it's sports, something that that's a complex skill that you want to do, right? And so having that kind of thing in your life that you're engaged with, so and I think for the most part, if anyone who's in that age range ideally would be doing something like that in addition to their work, because most people, by the time they've been in work life for a while, myself included, as I was practicing as a physician, I could mostly rely on automated knowledge and expertise, right? I wasn't, there weren't that many scenarios where I was like, oh, I haven't seen this before. I really have to think, right? And one of the kind of the models that I give people is that the more the more you can spend your day on autopilot, the less cognitive stimulation you've provided. So on the flip side of that, the more plastic reorganization that you've triggered in the brain, the greater the cognitive stimulus. So that means exposing yourself to new things, including having to learn new knowledge and skills. So that's kind of the overarching framework on the stimulation side, and then the other aspect being, am I providing the brain with everything it needs to respond? So just like in physical stimulus, you don't want to be going super hard and then not attending to the nutritional side, or the rest and recovery side, right? That's just as bad to overdo it on one side and not provide adequate support. So you want to make sure you're adequately supporting the brain's needs to maintain its synapses and to grow new ones. And so that includes the full sort of assessment of lifestyle, sleep and rest being huge, right, for brain health, and then the whole nutritional aspect, which encompasses some of what we just talked about in terms of blood testing, screening for metabolic disorders, and so making sure that piece is dialed in, and then things like stress levels and social connection, right? So I consider those to be the sort of the pillars of the support side. It's physical activity, sleep, rest and recovery, nutrition, stress, and then social support and connection. So we want to make sure we're giving our brain a robust stimulus, and in terms of cognitive stimulation, and then in supporting that stimulation with the full complement of things. And it's very much analogous to how an athlete would go about training their body and maintaining their physical health. And so the same exact thing applies to the brain, which is, I think, been the significance of it, and how intimately tied the actual cognitive demands and the stimulation are to the health of the brain tissue. No different than muscle tissue. I think it's as significant, but it's been overlooked, and it's easy to overlook.
That, I think it's a really good point. You made some great points there. Like, one, the stimulus at work. Mm-hmm. If you're on autopilot, then it's probably not that stimulating.
Right.
I really liked the framework of stimulate and support. That is just, I love the simplicity of it.
Right.
Like, you got to work out your brain. You got to give it what it needs. You mentioned physical activity, and I'm curious your take. Is there a certain physical activity that is better for your brain? Like, you'll hear, like, you really need HIIT. You need to bathe your brain in lactic acid. Mm-hmm. Is there stuff that people should be doing on the physical activity side that maybe is more beneficial than other things when they're doing their physical activity?
Right. I think there is some evidence that there are at least differential effects for certain kinds of physical activity. If you're just looking at it purely from the standpoint of things like intensity, whether it's cardiovascular primarily or whether it's resistance training. So I do think, I think by and large, just having regular physical activity is by far the most important before you worry about the nuances of that. If you want to go beyond, if you've got ticked off that box and you're getting regular activity, and then you want to go further, I do think that it makes sense to, have a base of lots of just low level movement all the time, right? And then resistance training, a couple of times a week, and then some high level intense, sprinting type of, HIT maybe once a week, something like that. And I think that if you're doing that, and you're probably covering all the potential mechanisms that you might want to be upregulating in the brain that may be non-overlapping in some way, right? And so I think so that's one framework for looking at of the health benefits, and in terms of their just an intensity level and whether it's cardiovascular or resistance training. The other is the actual cognitive demands of that activity. So in my view, if you want to kill all your birds with one stone, you take an activity that sort of bakes in a lot of that, and also is demanding from a cognitive aspect with things like strategy, coordination. So skill sports are great for this because they incorporate all of these different things. You have not only all of the muscular and cardiovascular demands, but you also have cognitive demands on the motor system, on strategy, things like that. And every time you do it, it's a little bit different. So it's not, you can't, some of it's automated, but none of it, but there's always sort of new cognitive challenges. So, I like to play tennis and I love the pickleball, that it's caught on so much because it's bringing in a lot of people, new people to the sport, and it ticks a lot of those boxes, so it's a great cognitive stimulus as well. So there's that piece as well, having some kind of, if you can add in, you can get all of it from a sport if you want to, and you get the cognitive piece and the physical piece, or if you prefer to just do the physical side and not the skill element, then make sure you're getting that piece from somewhere else,
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a few different ways to kind of stimulate your brain. We talked about music, talked about sport. What do you think, what are ways that surprising ways that people might not think about, this is stimulating my brain, or this is good for my brain, or ways that you've kind of worked with people where they're like, I don't want to do music, I don't want to do sport. Like, do you have any surprising ways that you've seen people stimulating their brain that might not be obvious to us?
I think probably if I want to highlight something that's not obvious but super necessary or important, I would say actually socializing, being around people, because the data here, I'm sure is tremendous in terms of the impact of social isolation and loneliness. And part of that is, and the data there is not just physical health and cognitive health, right? And I think the reasons for that are partly, of course, because of the emotional benefits, psychological benefits, having a support structure. But the other piece that people underestimate is the cognitive stimulation that comes from it. The three big things we learn as children are walking, talking, and socializing. Those are the things we need to be functioning independent adults. So our brain, that's what our brain evolved to do. And so being around other people, conversing with other people, being in social situations is an enormous cognitive stimulus. And so one of the reasons that we see deterioration is because of the loss of that stimulus when people are isolated. So making sure that you're having rewarding, connecting experiences around other people throughout your life, especially as you're getting older, is super important. And I think that to me, one of the best ways to do that is to orient it around certain activities that you're into. You mentioned the pickleball thing already. It's a great way to not just
Yep.
to get a sport, but also to stay connected to other people, to have those social interactions. So finding an activity that you love that's cognitively stimulating, but also has a community around it where you can stay connected with people, I think is a fantastic way to kind of orient your, as your foundation of keeping your brain healthy and ensuring that you're getting that human connection piece.
I love that. I mean, our last Surgeon General, right? His letter
Right.
when he left was all about the pandemic of loneliness, and I think that, like you said, every study has shown that social interaction is so important for happiness, for our brain, for our body, all of those things. So I really love that. And I love that, to think about the things that you talked about, there's community around music,
Right.
there's community around dance, there's community around sport, community around work, stimulating work.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
go
a
ahead.
reason music and dance has been found in every culture,
Yeah,
throughout human history, and I think there's that we should listen to that. It's there's a reason for that, and it's for because of all the benefits. And we have other things now that provide similar benefits to that, but I think it just
right.
speaks to how vital a role that has played, and how much we need it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious. I know that you've been working on a new book. It's just coming out. So I'd love for you to tell the audience about the book so they can go check it out.
Yeah. So the book is called Anyone Can Play Music. So that hopefully that conveys what it's primarily about. The and it came out of like I said, years ago, wanting to integrate the science of how to learn into how we learn music. So it's a book about learning music, but it's ultimately a book about how to learn anything. And it comes from, like I said, the reason we can learn anything at any age is because we have this ability to change the brain at any age. Learning complex skills relies on neurological mechanisms that we all share, right? So learning how to do anything is simply a matter of understanding how to leverage those mechanisms. And so the book is really a set of principles about, why anyone can learn, and then also about how to use the science to inform how we learn. Because one of the main reasons that people have, tend to avoid learning complex things like music the older they get is because of the perception that it's not possible, or because they may have tried before and been unsuccessful. And those that's and taking that to mean it just wasn't meant for them, right? That there wasn't,
Mhm.
when the reality is it's all about the process. It's about how we go about doing it. So wanted to have a way to give people the tools to do that, because I want as many people who want that experience to be able to have it, both because of the intrinsic rewards of learning music, but also because of all the cognitive benefits that come from it as well. And just in general, the importance, as we've talked about, of continuing to learn, continuing to perform complex skills as we age, because of its importance with brain health. But in order to be able to do that, it requires having kind of a framework for how to learn these things, which we weren't given in school. And in fact, much of the research shows that the ways that we go about learning in school are actually counterproductive in in learning, trying to learn for long-term retention and learning things like music. So it oftentimes involves unlearning some of the things that we've sort of historically done to get good grades and that sort of thing. So it's giving people the framework for how to learn anything is necessary if we want to help people reap the benefits of doing that sort of thing. So So that's kind of the nutshell of the book, and it's the subtitle is how to realize your musical potential with the laws of BrainJo. And the laws of BrainJo are just kind of these a set of principles, sort of one-line principles for best practices around learning.
Awesome. So if people want to find out more about BrainJo, if they want to find more about you, where should they go?
So you can go to the book's available anywhere, and then they can go to learn more about BrainJo and the music instruction. You can go to brainjo.academy, or you can just Google BrainJo and it should pop up. So
awesome. Josh, such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Medicine 3.0. We make this podcast so that you know where to turn for good information on keeping you and your loved ones healthy. Feel free to check us out at bionichealth.com, where we can help you live a longer, happier life.